I declare the closure of the 18th Congress.
The National Party Congress wraps up.
General Secretary Hu Jintao's report has put forward the concept of building a beautiful China.
And new leadership rises.
The people are the source of our strength.
With promise of even better days ahead,
there will be a significant difference in outlook.
The world takes note.
The U.S.-China relationship is the most important relationship in the world.
Comprehensive coverage of the CPC Congress and a look toward the future begins now.
Welcome to our Washington Broadcast Center for our special live program, Global Expectations. I'm Elaine Reyes. Over the next hour, we will introduce you to China's new leader, Xi Jinping. We'll also go in depth to see what's changing in China, how it impacts the Chinese and indeed the rest of the world. We begin by looking at what we learned during this 18th Party Congress and what we are still learning about Xi Jinping. First up, two correspondents. Nina Donahue is standing by live here in Washington with a closer look at Xi's very personal relationship with some ordinary Americans. But first, we go to Zhou Yu in Beijing to bring us up to speed on the political picture in China at this hour.
Well, good morning, Elaine. This is a milestone in Chinese politics. Xi Jinping succeeded Hu Jintao as the top leader of China's ruling party. But both men agreed this will be a very important event, and the CPC has helped transform China into a global giant. But with more challenges and changes, the Chinese people are asking for more. It closed one chapter of the party and opens another one. This is once-in-a-decade leadership change, and nearly half of the new Central Committee members are new faces. The outgoing General Secretary summed up the past decade with confidence.
China has seen continuous economic growth, improvement in democracy, social stability, and we have worked hard to bring the people more benefits than ever before.
Fast indeed. In 10 years, China has become the second largest economy, and its presence felt around the world. The Chinese Communist Party has been confident but not complacent. The new leaders of the CPC are clear-headed about the future challenges.
There are many pressing problems within the party that need to be resolved, particularly corruption, being divorced from the people, and bureaucracy.
To ensure a balanced growth, the idea of scientific development is enshrined in the party's constitution. The outgoing General Secretary also laid out a vision for his successor.
We should double our GDP by 2020 and per capita income for both urban and rural residents.
The new party leadership are ready to turn the blueprint into reality. But most importantly, it will build a party of better representation and stronger governance, without following the Western model.
We will ensure that our party will remain at the core of leadership in advancing the cause of socialism with Chinese characteristics.
By making adaptive changes, the CPC has done a good job to survive and thrive. But the country is moving on. The people are better off and better informed, and it remains a big challenge for the ruling party to continue to deliver. Well, Elaine, this is a very competitive process for the seven-man to make its way into the standing committee, especially for Xi. Xi Jinping is a tested politician. He's considered by many to be open, straightforward, and down to earth. He was poised and confident during his first public appearance yesterday. He has been serving in the remote mountainous areas as well as the developed coastal cities, both in the military and the civilians. He also has a lot of exposure to the international affairs already. During his talks with Vice President at a reception last year, I was there. He's kind of a person that can make everybody around him feel comfortable, but also his strong presence. Of course, he has many challenges ahead. He mentioned he has to deliver economic progress, social stability, political reform, and a cleaner environment. But it seems Xi and his team are prepared to take on the challenge on day one. Elaine?
All right, Zoya, thank you so much for that report from Beijing. We'll check in with you later on. Right now, we also want to bring in Nina Donahue, who's covered Xi Jinping's trip to Iowa earlier this year. Nina.
That's right, Elaine. Well, earlier this year in February, along with his trip to Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles, Xi made a real point of stopping off in a small farming community in Iowa, Muscatine. It was a very sentimental trip for him. He went there as a young man, as an agriculture official in 1985. During that time, he stayed with an ordinary American family. He toured farms and businesses, and his time in Muscatine certainly left a lasting impression. On Valentine's Day 2012, Washington laid out the red carpet for Xi Jinping, a meeting at the Oval Office with President Obama.
A cooperative relationship based on mutual interest and mutual respect is not only in the interests of the United States and China, but is also in the interests of the region and in the interests of the United States, in the interests of the world. Lunch
at the State Department with Hillary Clinton. Dinner with Vice President Joe Biden and commerce leaders. And, unprecedented for a foreign vice president, a full honor cordon at the Pentagon. Then he was a leader in waiting, but was still accorded the best of American hospitality at the highest levels of government and, just as important to Xi, in America's heartland, Iowa. The state's governor and longtime friend of the vice president, Terry Branstad, hosted a state dinner for 600 and an agricultural symposium.
We have a real personal relationship with the next leader of China. We're excited. He's a very friendly, outgoing, personable individual, and I think he's going to help us improve the relations between the United States of America and the People's Republic of China.
But the most sentimental detour, a day spent in Muscatine, a small farming community on the banks of the Mississippi River. And until then, best known for its most famous resident, classic American author Mark Twain. But now, almost as well known for its most famous overseas visitor. To me, you are America, he said to his old friends. Assembled once more before a roaring fire in the home of Sarah Landy, who organised his visit of 30 years before. He visited local businesses and shared his agricultural expertise. And for a moment, Muscatine's community was at the centre of world events.
Knowing that he was here 30 years ago has caused a lot of excitement, that he remembered who we were, and it just caused a lot of nice feelings, I think, towards the Muscatine and the world in general.
Writer Mark Twain immortalised Muscatine for its sunsets. But for China's next president, its place in his personal story will also become the stuff of history. Those old friends from Iowa still haven't been forgotten. Their hospitality was rewarded. In June of this year, Xi invited them to China to spend a week with him. Elaine.
Okay, Nina Donahue, thank you so much. Well, Xi has already said his party is facing great challenges, but he has promised to work to meet, quote, the expectations of both history and the people. Earlier this afternoon, my colleague Anna Naidu spoke to Victor Gao, the director of China's National Association for International Studies.
When we look at this new group of leaders that's assuming power in China, is this a turning point for the country, or is there going to be more of an emphasis on continuity, perhaps more of the same?
No, I think what happened today in Beijing is of historical significance, not only for China, but also for the rest of the world. And the new lineup of 7 members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo will guide and govern China for the coming 10 years. And this coming 10 year will be a very important time, because by now China is already the second largest economy in the world, and the Chinese government has already pledged to double the GDP of 2010 by 2020. Therefore, by the end of the coming 10-year period, by 2022, when Mr. Xi Jinping will finish his term of office, China most likely will become the largest economy in the world, ahead of the United States. Therefore, I think China both need continuity, because after all, we are still very much on the track of the course of action chartered by Deng Xiaoping more than 30 years ago. But China also needs to continue to blaze a new path of development and keep innovating and keep coming up with more creative and ingenious solutions to deal with the ever-changing challenges that China is faced with.
What do you see are the major challenges that this leadership will face?
Now, I think, first of all, I think the Chinese development model needs to be sustainable. Right now, for example, the energy efficiency is still very low in China compared with other developed countries. There is big room for China to make improvement in this area. And also, China now depends on imported crude oil, up to about 57% for all the oil it consumed. And such a high percentage of dependence on imported oil may not be sustainable. Further, China has been mostly relying on exports. Foreign trade, import and export combined together accounted for about 50% of the GDP for last year. And such a high percentage on foreign trade may also not be sustainable, especially when you look at the economic difficulties in the United States and financial crisis in Europe. So China needs to change the development model from a very excessive dependence on import and export to a development with two legs. Import and export on the one leg, but also domestic consumption on the other hand. So I think there will be a lot of things that this new lineup of leadership need to do to change the economic mix of China and also to reduce emission, to turn green in the Chinese development, and also to strive for sustainability in our development. Further, I think how to allocate the benefits of the economic development so that most people will enjoy, more and more people enjoy the benefits of the economic development in China, so the society will be more fair and equitable. That's a big challenge. And also, for example, sectors like education, like public health, need to open much more than they are today to private investment, as well as international investment.
Thanks, Anand. Just ahead, a closer look at the relationship between China and the rest of the world. But first, a sample of some of the hopes and dreams from ordinary people for the years ahead.
我希望中国的楼市可以降一点，然后让老百姓都可以买得起房子。
工作可能不一定想做嘛，现在我在工作，可能我想自己出去闯一闯。
经常到国外去旅游，到国内旅游。就自家身体嘛，越来越健康，就搿种样。
就政策放松一点吧，对小企业放松一点。大企业嘛，有些它这个政策太好了。
我就希望毕业以后能够找一份稳定的工作，然后能孝顺爸爸妈妈。
Welcome back to our special Global Expectations. As we focus on the future of China, we can't ignore the recent past. In the lead up to the recent U.S. presidential election, we heard a lot of complaining about China manipulating its currency. Listen to the Republican candidate, Mitt Romney.
Now, we're going to have to make sure that as we trade with other nations, that they play by the rules, and China hasn't. One of the reasons, or one of the ways they don't play by the rules, is artificially holding down the value of their currency.
Now, Romney went on to say that if he'd won, he'd label China a currency manipulator. But is that claim really true? Let's check in with Mike Walter.
Well, as you said, Elaine, many politicians, actually both Republicans and Democrats, have made a habit of blaming America's trade deficit with China on Beijing's alleged currency manipulation. But the data tells another story. Since 2005, the renminbi has increased in value more than 25%. Now, the cash surplus in China's current account, the national equivalent of a personal checking account, well, that has actually shrunk. It now accounts for more than 10% of China's total economic output. Now, that dates back to 2007. And the IMF expects that that percentage is going to decline to around 2.3% in 2012. So that's about an 80% drop. So earlier this year, Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao said the renminbi was now close to its equilibrium value. In other words, its value is fair. And many Western economists agree, making the currency manipulation complaints by U.S. politicians look at least 5 or 6 years out of date. In fact, when we spoke to an economist who tracks currency manipulation at the Washington-based Peterson Institution for International Economics, Joseph Ganao, told me that there are countries much worse than China when it comes to manipulating currency. Singapore, for example. These days, even Switzerland and Japan are arguably worse than China, he said. And there are other countries like Israel that are pretty bad. But we know none of those countries have been attacked or even mentioned by U.S. politicians for doing so. Anand.
Thanks, Mike. Now, for more perspective, as we mentioned earlier, Chinese economy is in the midst of a downturn due to lingering uncertainty. But leaders this week have tried to provide a blueprint for what China will look like in the next 10 years. Let's go back to Beijing now, and our correspondent Zoya for more on that. Well, we'll do that later, but let's first go to CCTV's Sean Calebs. He joins us now live from the White House with a look at the state of relations between the United States and China. Sean?
Well, Anand, we know that President Barack Obama is going to be in the White House for the next 4 years, and China's leadership is in place for the next decade. So both countries are basically working with a political clean slate, so to speak, free to carve their own path toward economic growth and reform. The question, how will these two nations proceed?
For decades, the United States has been the force driving the global economy. Like it or not, the landscape is changing. China's economy has grown at a blistering 10.7% for the last 10 years.
Obviously, I think both sides have to adjust to what I would call a new relationship. It's no longer a world where the U.S. is the superpower and the only superpower.
Under President Obama, the United States has been pushing to ease the massive federal trade deficit with China and find a way for U.S.-based companies to expand and operate in China. At the same time, China wants to spend $100 billion abroad, but only 1 or 2% has been spent in the United States.
It's not clear that many people in America welcome this money. There are security concerns. There is a reluctance to sell what I call natural resources to China. There are concerns about whether China will be a good neighbor.
For example, the U.S. Trade Commission says China is dumping solar panels in the United States at cut-rate cost, hurting U.S. manufacturers. China denies the charge, but the result? China will have to pay a tariff of 25 to 35% to sell solar panels here. Tensions have also been elevated by the so-called Asian pivot, moving more American military power to Asia.
We believe China can be a partner, but we're also sending a very clear signal that America is a Pacific power.
The Chinese say they welcome foreign investment, but Wang says it comes with strings attached. China wants companies to bring the latest, most high-tech advances, but that fosters tension and mistrust that China could unduly benefit from the intellectual property. For all the downsides, Wang says the two nations do have a good opportunity to tear down barriers and eliminate mistrust. China has just selected its leaders for the next 10 years, and Obama isn't handcuffed by constraints of campaigning.
President Obama doesn't have to get reelected. So he basically can work with the agenda saying what makes sense, what is good for America, what will be my legacy be.
And future economic success could very well hinge on these two countries' ability to compromise. But there is no question that China and the United States remain divided on a number of key issues, including economic. So the path moving forward could, Anand, very well go down a very bumpy road.
Sean, listening to your report there, it would appear that the United States wants it both ways. On the one hand, we heard President Obama there saying that he wants China to be a partner with the United States. But at the same time, he said America will maintain its dominance or its presence there in the Pacific. So, it, as you pointed out, fosters tension between these two countries. Have you seen any evidence of some means to ease those tensions?
The simple answer is no. If you just look at what's going to happen tomorrow, President Obama is on the eve of his first international trip since being reelected. He's going to Asia, but he is not making a stop in China. He's going to Cambodia, Myanmar, but this is a time he could go to China. He could talk about how are we going to move forward now that both these countries have their political futures locked in for the foreseeable future, but it's not happening. Secondly, remember Hillary Clinton went to Asia recently on a much ballyhoo trip, and during that time she talked about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a great platform to foster trading among all nations in the Pacific, except China. China is not a member of the TPP, and that is done on purpose. So in talking to Yukon Wang today, he said that can only be looked from China's perspective as something antagonistic, that you want to walk to the door, say, let's talk about this kind of trade that can enhance both countries, but we're going to shut the door.
Okay, thanks, Sean. Sean Caleb's there at the White House. Now, as we mentioned earlier, China's economy is in the midst of a downturn due to lingering uncertainty. But leaders this week have tried to provide a blueprint for what China will look like in the next 10 years. Let's go back now to Beijing and our correspondent, Zoya, with more details on that. Zoya?
Yes, indeed. The outgoing General Secretary Hu Jintao gave a long list of promises at the Chinese Communist Party's National Congress. Well, the buzzword is still reform. Actually, it is a long list of promises. One most important thing is that the General Secretary has laid out a vision for China for the next 10 years, how China will be looking like in the coming decade. One most important thing on top of that is China's GDP will double to $12 trillion by the year 2020. That's almost half the size of Germany's size and a little bit down the US size. And also, he has been promising it will be a cleaner environment and richer society. One of the most exciting promises is that the per capita GDP of the Chinese will come to $9,000. That's half the figure of the US number. And what these promises have been received by the average Chinese, let's take a listen.
我觉得2020年可能能够实现，还是要有信心吧。
好像没什么信心啊，因为好像很久没涨过工资了，但是物价一直在涨。
国家说要翻番，怎么样就保证翻番？你比如像我们私营的东西，私营的就是你做得出来的有，做不出来没有了，那怎么保证，对吧？我觉得这是虚的。
这拿到手再说，现在你还没到手，这是要到2020年了，还有8年了。
Well, how to achieve these goals, it is still an open question. China will have its cabinet reshuffle next spring. By reading the current list of the Central Committee members, the Central Governor Chinese Bernanke will not be on the list, but Governor Zhou Xiaochuan said his resignation will not affect the monetary policy here in China. And also the Finance Minister and Commerce Minister will resign from their posts. And Vice Premier Wang Qishan will take in charge of the discipline inspection work. But Premier Wen Jiabao has been ambitious about pushing his plan of keeping economic growth and also redressing the balance of income disparity. And I want to talk about the Chinese economy a little bit. The Chinese will be more open and richer. It will be a blessing for the Americans because it will bring more jobs and buy more American products, invest more in America. Back to you.
That was Zoya reporting there from Beijing. Now, Hank Greenberg has no shortage of titles. The former CEO and chairman of the insurance giant AIG is currently the head of Star Companies, a leading insurance and investment firm operating on 5 continents. Greenberg is also vice chairman at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. As Karina Huber found out, he's bullish on China despite the slowing economy.
I'm bullish on China, have been, continue to be. You know, of course it's slowed down. Everybody has slowed down. And they're not in a different world, they're in the same world that we are. But there are many things they can do to stimulate the economy, and I think they will.
You think they will? So with this transition in government, you believe that we'll see more stimulus?
I think we'll see more stimulus. There's some things that have to be done, and I think they'll get around to doing them.
But what do you see as the biggest challenges for China right now?
Well, a number of things. Obviously, growth is one. China's got a lot of SOEs. Many are not very efficient. And I think they have to do something about that. Because these SOEs, inefficient ones, are sucking money out of the banks for liquidity. And that can be better used for other things to grow the economy. And I believe that the SMEs, small, medium-sized industries and companies, can use that capital to grow and hire people and create more jobs. By doing that, they spend more as consumers, and you begin to build a consumer market. I think that it's not going to happen overnight, but I think that's a plan that I think has to come.
Another concern is just the aging population in China. How do you think that's going to impact their economy?
I think the one-child policy is probably going to change. because they have an aging population, and puts a great burden on the children who are supporting maybe 4, maybe even 6 adults. Social Security is not uniformly as good as it has to be, and I think it will be. It's increasing every year and broadening out, and so I think that they'll deal with that.
Also, during the presidential election here, we saw a lot of China bashing. The election is over, so we expect the rhetoric to probably cool down. What do you think Obama's approach to China should be right now?
Look, it's the second largest economy in the world. We have so many things in common that our economies really complement each other. Not without problems, obviously. But you know, during the run-up to the elections in the United States, and you'd expect in that run-up positions being taken that are really either not sustainable, and maybe even not even realistic. Do we want to have a trade war with China, or do we want to have a trade agreement with China?
Do you think China's unfairly singled out in terms of suspicion when it comes to FDI here?
I think that, and I've been very candid about this with the Chinese. I serve on a number of Track 2 dialogues. There is a distrust between our countries, and we have to rid both sides of that. We have to have some frank conversations and get rid of the distrust issues. Now, not easy, obviously, but there's no reason for that to exist. We have to get beyond that.
And in terms of the global stakes, how important is the relationship between China and the U.S. for the global economy?
I think it's very important.
Why so?
I think it's very important. Look, we're 2 huge countries. You know, how we work out things is going to affect the whole world.
Hank Greenberg there talking to Karina Huber. Now let's send it back to Elaine.
All right, thanks, Anand. Just ahead, we're going to take a look at China on the global stage when it comes to international turmoil. From Syria to the Diaoyu Islands, we've seen no shortage of high-profile stories over the past year. But first, we hear from students at George Washington University about their views on China and their hopes for the years ahead.
I think my generation knows basically what you learn in school. And I think that's a lot different than what's really going on over there.
I think it's very important, given how closely tied our 2 economies are, that we kind of start to understand each other a little bit more. I think it's 2 very different worlds, but in a lot of ways we're very similar.
Moving forward, more and more people will become more informed about China, and as they learn more about it, I'm sure they'll be like me and like what they see and be impressed and hopefully come over there.